Welcome to Two Bees in a Podcast, brought to you by the Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. It is our goal to advance the understanding of honeybees and beekeeping, grow the beekeeping community, and improve the health of honeybees everywhere. In this podcast, you'll hear research updates, beekeeping management practices discussed, and advice on beekeeping from our resident experts, beekeepers, scientists, and other program guests. Join us for today's program, and thank you for listening to Two Bees in a Podcast. In this episode of Two Bees in a Podcast, we will be talking with Sarah Red-Laird, who is the founder of Bee Girl. She will be joining us to talk about bee nutrition and forage, as well as regenerative agriculture. We will also be joined by Dr. Bill Kern, who will continue talking about various pests in the apiary, with today's focus being bears. And of course, we will end with everyone's favorite questions and answers. Welcome back to Two Bees in a Podcast. For this segment, I'm your host, Jamie Ellis, accompanied by...
Voo. Amy Voo.
Amy, every time I point to you, I just never know what's going to come out of your mouth. It could be you saying your name weird or a burp, as we've talked about kind of behind the scenes.
Thanks, Jamie.
But we need to be serious in this segment. So in this segment, we are accompanied by Sarah Red-Laird. Sarah is the founder and executive director of the Bee Girl organization, a nonprofit with a mission to educate and inspire communities to conserve bees, their flowers, and our countryside. To see her latest project updates, you can visit her Instagram and Facebook account at Sarah Bee Girl, that's Sarah with an H, or www.beegirl.org. All of this information will be in our show notes that you can find after you listen to our podcast. Sarah, it is fantastic to have you on board. Thank you for joining us on Two Bees in a Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm very happy to sit down with you two.
Yeah, Sarah, you know, like in the introduction, kind of in the behind the scenes, getting you ready for this, I mentioned this to you, but I wanted to share it with our listeners as well. That one of the reasons that we're interviewing you is because you were requested in our social media accounts. People put who they want to have us interview, and your name came up. So I'm excited to get to know you.
Yeah, I'm flattered.
So Sarah,
thanks all. Thanks people.
We just started following your social media account, and I ran into a TED Talk that you did. And did you know that Sarah used to be a firefighter?
Did you?
Sure.
I thought it was very awesome.
That is neat. That's neat.
But she thinks beekeeping is more dangerous and fun and adventurous, so she decided with beekeeping instead.
Well, Sarah, I think maybe a good way to get started, we've got a lot of questions that we want to ask you, but I think a good way to get started is just tell us about yourself, where you are right now, like where are you calling in from, how'd you get into beekeeping, and then we'll use that as the platform from which we can jump into these questions.
Sure, yeah. I am calling in from Ashland, Oregon.
Okay.
In beautiful Southern Oregon, nestled in the hills. I'm for context, on the I-5 corridor, about 7-ish miles north of the California border. I got into beekeeping. Well, I can't remember a time in my life that I wasn't into bees. Starting when I was a little kid, I just was so incredibly fascinated with bees, and I loved honey, and have very pleasant summer memories of my aunt had bees that were kept on her small farming community, and so I was around for honey harvest when I was little, and I just remember having warm honeycomb straight out of the hives, and I think that did it for a lifelong obsession of bees. But I didn't officially get into beekeeping until about 2009, when I did a project in Jerry Bromenshank's lab at the University of Montana in Missoula when I was a student there. And my degree is actually in resource conservation, and my career path was pointing me towards water policy. I wanted to be the executive director of a watershed council.
Sure.
But that I graduated during the recession, and there was 0 jobs, and Jerry and the crew liked having me around, so they came up with a position for me as a research assistant in the lab. So I stayed there, thinking I would just do bees until I moved back to water policy, and 10 years later, here I still am.
Well, I think you made the better of the two decisions. I mean, of course, we all need water, but we also all need bees. So
yeah, true. And now it's actually kind of cool. It's come full circle, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, but my work now focuses a lot on regenerative agriculture.
Sure.
And a big part of that is restoring water cycles.
Well, let's start there.
Come back around.
Yeah, let's start exactly there. What is regenerative agriculture? Why does it interest you? Why is it important to us?
Yeah, so regenerative agriculture is it's the short way, I guess, to explain what it is leaving the landscape better than when you found it.
Okay.
And in today's agriculture, that's not often the case. The soil is being depleted. We're losing our topsoil. There's a lot of chemical inputs going into the soil. Extremely heavy tillage is part of how a lot of our farming is carried out, and that's not leaving the soil and the landscape better than when you found it. And so the principles of regenerative ag, to go a little deeper, are to minimize disturbance in the soil and on the landscape. So that's mechanical and chemical disturbance. Leave an armor on the soil surface. So cover that soil, keep it from washing into the waterways, keep it from your topsoil washing away into the waterways, keep any of those chemicals you might be using from washing into the waterways, and also protect that topsoil. You increase plant diversity. So instead of just planting one thing in a monocrop, plant many things all at once and stack your benefits. Yeah, and there's many benefits that you can stack in many plants that you can stack even in commodity crops. Leave living roots in the ground as long as possible. So try and work with perennial plants. And then the most important thing, I think, is integrating animals back into the system. And that is, of course, things like livestock by using adaptive and holistic grazing, but then also bees. Bees are an animal too, and making sure that they have a part in that system, as well as other. I was just at a farm, apricot lane farms last week, a couple of days ago, and they have integrated grazing into the system, but then they were having massive fly issues, and then they realized that they had a fly super bloom from the maggots and all the animal poo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then so they introduced chickens behind the livestock, and now they have zero flies. Yeah. Because the chickens eat all those worms. So so it's kind of like just it's farming like it used to be 50, 100 years ago and back.
Yeah,
but then
Sarah.
Also using like but now what we know now as well.
Sure. So, Sarah, I actually did my undergraduate degree in soils and environmental science. So I'm pretty familiar with soils and, non-tillage. And I actually got funding to do like this undergraduate project to compare two cornfields, till versus no-till, and the effects on the denitrification process on climate change and whatnot. But anyway, so I'm pretty familiar with soil, and I think it's really great, for us to start thinking more sustainably as far as our farming practices. But you kind of mentioned forage, a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about why beekeepers should care about, the soils? And also, are your projects focused primarily on honeybees? Do you work with wild bees? So why should beekeepers care about this?
Right. So I worked in Jerry Bromanshake's lab, way back when, we were looking at clothianidin, which is a neonicotinoid that's used in corn. And our research was looking at, is there lethal effects of clothianidin getting into corn pollen? And is that corn pollen making its way back into the hive? And when it does get back into the hive, are those lethal or maybe even sublethal doses of this neonicotinoid getting back to the hive? And that's really become the buzzword in bees and agriculture. And bee health is neonicotinoids, neonics, and everybody's kind of pointing their finger at this one pesticide of being like, oh, just get rid of this thing. and everything will be okay, and the bees will be okay. But I wasn't really sussing that out from what I was seeing in the lab back then, because anecdotally, when the professors came back with all these samples, from Nebraska and Kansas, they were talking about how, oh my gosh, it's corn as far as the eye can see. You wouldn't even believe it. It's just green. We got lost so many times. These roads just head into more and more and more cornfields. And so I thought that was interesting that people are still able to keep bees out there. And so I got on Google Maps and I did a little bit of research, and I found out that 98% of Nebraska's tallgrass prairie has been converted into agricultural and urban landscapes. Wow. We've lost 98% of the original habitat that was there. However, the bees were still able, the colors of the pollen that were coming back were really fascinating. It wasn't just corn pollen. There was purple pollen, orange pollen, green pollen, pink pollen, red pollen, so many pollen. So I started looking around, and the only thing that I can think, there are some hillsides and some riparian zones where the corn is not planted directly up to the riparian zone. So I thought, well, these bees must be getting this pollen from riparian zones. And when I jumped on Google Earth, it was miles and miles and miles and miles from the hive site, or nearest riparian zones were. So I kind of had this light bulb that I don't know if it's just a pesticide issue here. I think what we're looking at is a landscape use issue and a nutrition issue. I think these bees are starving to death, and they're flying themselves to death trying to find good food, good nutrient-dense food to feed their families.
Well, Sarah, let me interject a comment there, because I think what you said is incredibly important. I think the listeners need to hear this. So you're familiar with the Bee Informed Partnership. They do yearly surveys of beekeepers asking what's responsible for losses of their colonies. And if you cut the fluff, from the surveys, it basically boils down to three things that commercial beekeepers talk about. Number one, in no particular order, Varroa and the things that they carry. Number two, queen issues. And again, this is not ranked. This is me just saying things. And the third thing that they mention regularly is nutrition. Nutrition. I think nutrition management is very important. Of course, beekeepers do that. They try to address it at the colony by adding sugar syrup and adding pollen patties, and I could go on for days about whether or not pollen patties work. But at the end of the day, your comment about nutrition, this idea that they're starving or they're nutritionally deprived, or worse yet, energetically, the benefit that they're getting versus the cost that they're making to get that benefit is really not in their favor at the moment. And we talk about these monocultures and all of this stuff. I think you're exactly right. How do we ensure that the habitat can provide what exactly the bees need, right?
Yeah. And there's research that came out of Penn State that said that bees really prefer to fly within 1.5 miles of the colony. Mm-hmm. But on these maps, I was finding these per potentially nutritionally dense zones, riparian zones, 7 miles away from the colony.
That's crazy. It's funny you say that 1.5 miles is cool, but I tell you, when I was in Keith Delaplane's lab at the University of Georgia, he would always bring up this old referee manuscript, and I forget who wrote it and forget when it was. Is even though they prefer 1.5 miles or something like that, they work best energetically within about 300 feet of the colony. So yes, they will go further, but once you cross that 300 feet, or is it 300 meters? Regardless, it's 300, relatively close. Once they cross that line, the energy benefit to them starts to diminish. So yeah, that 1.5 mile radius is kind of what's best to keep them in. If they're going beyond that, they are working really hard for what they're getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're utilizing those calories themselves, right?
Absolutely.
Being able to bring back forage or pollen and nectar to the to the colony. So that was just kind of my light bulb, and then I really just hung on to habitat and hung on to nutrition, and nobody was talking about nutrition issues or habitat issues that I could find back in 2009, and I had a really hard time getting my foot in the door and trying to figure out who I could talk to. And like you said, the only person that I was really referred to was a researcher in Arizona that was looking at pollen patties. And I was like, no, that's not what I'm talking about.
Sure.
I'm not talking about pollen patties. I'm talking about flowers on the landscape without chemicals on them. And the only person that I was really able to connect with was Zach Browning, who's a commercial beekeeper based out of North Dakota. And he's been pushing the habitat conversation forward for quite a long time and doing important work and still continues to do important work. And so we were able to share ideas and support each other's ideas and projects going forward. But I still really wasn't finding my niche in habitat. And that wasn't until, I left Jerry Bromashank's lab and started my own nonprofit, which was education-based at first, because that's what the market really wanted. There was a lot of backyard beekeepers that wanted to know what they were doing, and there was a lot of, and I also started a kids program, but really what I always wanted to be doing was habitat conservation and thinking about nutrition. And that ended up falling in my lap, or I went down that path when I was a speaker at the 2014 Northwest Farmers Union and Washington Cattlemen's Association conference in Spokane, Washington.
That's a weird combination.
And a little random, but I met two farmers there, ranchers, Beth and Morris Robinette, father-daughter team, who practice holistic management on their farm, and adaptive regenerative grazing practices. So using animals on the landscape to leave the world better than it was before they came. And I couldn't really wrap my head around that. And so I asked if I could come out to their ranch before I got in the airplane the next day. And they invited me to go out. And this was in October in Spokane. And it was a very bleak looking landscape. It's a lot of rolling hills covered with wheat stubble, covered with chem fallow, which is how the farmers in Eastern Washington were taught to care for their soils. They basically put a blanket of chemicals over the top of their soil. And it's a very monochrome and sad looking view. And then I get to the Robinette's ranch, and there was green grass and silky, shiny, fat, happy cows. And they showed me the system that they use where that our landscapes evolved with large herds of bison or large herds of elk moving around the landscape in a giant ball of eating, pooping, peeing microbiome goodness.
Sure.
And the grizzly bears and the coyotes and the wolves and mountain lions kept them in this ball to keep safe. Think of like emperor penguins or something like that. And then they moved throughout the landscape every day, but we've taken the large predators out of the system. So now our elk and our cows and whoever's out there in the landscape just willy-nilly go wherever. They eat the delicious plants, which are usually the ones that flower. And then they leave a lot of the less good tasting, maybe more invasive plants behind. And they also just destroy our riparian zones. So we've gotten into trouble with the way that we've been grazing our livestock, and holistic grazing is a way to reverse that by going back to this way of bunching your animals up and constantly moving them around the landscape. And you can do that either with a horse and dog team, or how they do it is electric fencing. So every single 24 to 48 hours, they're out there moving these cattle through the paddocks, which takes minutes. It takes them longer to drive down there than it does to actually move the cattle. And they love it. And because they're going from somewhere where they totally used into a new, fresh little prairie of green grass. And so it was just, I had this huge aha when I looked down, and there was a flower, there was a dandelion blooming in one of their paddocks in October in Eastern Washington. And there was a little bee fly on the, it wasn't a bee, but it was a little beneficial insect just hanging out on that little dandelion. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's something here. There's some sort of synergy going on here between grazing animals and moving them in this way, and perhaps the potential of getting more flowers on the landscape for our bees. And so, and it's done completely without chemicals. They're able to run their whole farming and ranching operation without chemicals because the nutrition, the urea and the poo that comes from the cattle, and then they also use compost tea, is able to really to boost the microbiome and the health of the landscape. And so they don't have to use any kind of chemical aspect on their farm.
Sure.
So that's the dream, right? For beekeepers is more flowers on the landscape and less or no chemical inputs at all. So that's why regenerative agriculture and this kind of farming style, I think, is important to beekeepers, is that it's a way to get food on the landscape, not covered in chemicals for our bees. And so my regenerative bee pasture project is looking at how can we partner with our ranchers who our grazing lands make up the vast majority of land use in this country.
Yes, Sarah. So
how amazing would that be if we could partner with our cattlemen and cattlewomen to cover every inch of that landscape with flowers.
Sarah, so I have a question for you, and this might be a little controversial as far as what I'm about to ask, but it seems like from what you're saying, regenerative farming, wow, I'll try to say that 5 times. It seems like that's just has to be the way things should be, right? But so why has it taken so long? I mean, why is the majority of farmland still not doing that? What do you think challenges or barriers might be? I mean, if it was that easy, wouldn't everyone be doing it?
That's a great question, and I can't answer for every farmer in the U.S., but I can speak to what I've seen. I have the great privilege of serving on the board of directors for the National Farmers Union. I'm now the president of the Northwest Farmers Union, so I get to be sitting at the table with those corn and soy farmers in North Dakota and Minnesota, and I get to talk to them and ask them, hey, why are you so doing this when it's so it seems like common sense to move a different direction? And it's because this is the way that they were taught by their extension agents and by agribusiness and by chemical companies, that this is what you have to do in order to be profitable as a farmer. In order to have yield, you need to spray this and you need to treat your soil this way, and you can't have cattle on the landscape and you can't integrate animals because it'll cause food safety issues. And it's just the way that we've been taught post World War II how to manage our landscapes. And it's been so incredibly focused on yield, but not necessarily focused on profitability. And so, it's a mindset shift that has to happen, because there are plenty of examples of farmers and ranchers out there using regenerative practices that are netting a lot of money. And one of the reasons is because they have weaned themselves off of the reliance on chemical agriculture.
Well, Sarah, let me ask.
With that, go ahead.
I was going to say, let me ask specifically about flowers. You've been talking a lot about that. So we've been doing research on floral mixes in my lab now for 10 or 12 years, and so I struggle with the concept, right? I've worked with lots of growers. I always tell people we've been studying it longer than it's been cool. It was cool when Barack Obama said that, I'm going to give money and people are going to plant flowers. Well, that's a great idea, but I struggle. I'll just put it simply. I struggle to think of and find wildflowers that can benefit honeybee colonies. It's easy for me to come up with wildflower mixes that you can put out on your farms and see a lot of native bees fluttering around and you can feel good about yourself. But I struggle with what wildflower mixes might be necessary to support healthy honeybee population. So let me preface that with what I'm saying. So I can think of a lot of things that might provide pollen, but in a lot of times beekeepers are trying to come up with nectar alternatives, and I just struggle with that. Almost all the nectiferous flowers that I can think of, almost all the honeys that I can think of that are named across the country come from trees or shrubs. And so it's very difficult in my mind to think about providing those resources. So when I read kind of your bio, when I did a little bit of research looking at these questions that we were going to ask you, I'm thinking maybe less, about benefiting honeybees on farms and more about conservation of just wildlands that have these things that honeybees need. Like in Florida, that would be places that have gallberry and palmetto. Maybe out where you are, it's something different. So can you talk just briefly about seed mixes. Can you talk about what does it mean for providing floral resources specifically for honeybees?
Yeah, absolutely. And it all comes down, for me, it all comes back to diversity.
Sure.
We have to have all of it. We can't, I think trees and shrubs are an extraordinarily important part of the farm. Sure. And hedgerows, and they always were. And there's even specific, like in the UK, there's specific animals that have been adapted to hedges,
of
like
course,
hedgehogs.
Yeah. That's where the hedge come from.
Extinct because all the hedgerows were ripped out and to quote unquote advanced agriculture. But then, and then there's a trophical collapse because they provided a really important service of eating pests that are going to eat your crop. So that's another tangent. But sure. Yeah, so it's down to diversity. And my primary focus tends to be honeybees because that's my background and that's sure. what I understand and that's what I've worked in for the last decade. But I have started to also shift towards native bees and native bee monitoring. I'm part of the Oregon Bee Atlas, which is like a supercharged citizen scientist initiative to start native bee taxonomic collections and then also submit those to Oregon State University to start getting a good handle on how the abundance and diversity of native bee species in Oregon. And then I also am part of a project where I monitor bees on a vernal pool restoration project. That's a collaboration between our Department of Agriculture, our Department of Transportation and the Nature Conservancy. And we're using bees as an indicator species of the success of the project. So I am really lucky that I get to go out and watch native bees and watch the flowers that they really like and watch how they interact with honeybees. And there are quite a few relatively easy to grow flowers out there that can be beneficial to both honeybees and native bees. And so I don't think it has to be a either or. And I think that it just really does come down to diversity. I think that we can have clover and something like Collinsia, which sure. is extraordinarily important to queen bumblebees in the spring on the same landscape.
Sure. So usually what I tell people when I talk about this, I just simply say, this is a budding area of research that needs a lot of students. We need a lot of graduate students, a lot of faculty members looking at this because, having been in it now for over a decade, I'm not at the moment convinced that it's as easy as just planting flowers. I think it's going to take a more holistic, integrated approach to providing lots of floral resource habitat. I like your comment about hedgerows and trees and shrubs, ensuring that places like that occur on farms. I think wildflowers are part of the answer, but I think where you're going is heading in the right direction. And frankly, I think that this is going to open up quite a field. I mean, I've already seen it in the last decade. The number of native bee scientists who exist at universities has absolutely exploded. The number of students they're able to attract have exploded. Almost every university that has a honeybee person has a native bee person now who's looking at putting out wildflowers or habitat restoration and all of that stuff. So I really think the next decade is going to really show us a lot of new information on this topic, and I appreciate you kind of being on the cutting edge of that work.
Yeah, and I think our seed mix that we're trialing right now, I think we have 17 different plants in there that we're trying to get to grow. And that's the thing too is you mentioned everybody, so now planting flowers for bees is the thing. And I have so many people that I've talked to that are anywhere from just backyard gardeners to somebody who owns 40 acres that they're not doing anything with it and they want to put flowers out there, to farmers that really do have a handle on what they're doing. Sure. And they all are still kind of struggling with figuring out what to plant out there and what can be the most beneficial, and even getting the flowers to grow in the first place.
Sure.
And that's again where it comes back to soil. I was just I spoke at a beekeeping conference in Los Angeles, and a beekeeper there lives in, oh my gosh, I want to say somewhere in the Midwest area, maybe it's Nebraska. And he said, I've been trying to get flowers to grow. I have 30 acres that I've tried to get make bee pasture into, and I've been trying to get flowers to grow for 3 years and I can't get them to grow. And I said, well, what was there before you were starting to plant flowers? And he was like, well, conventionally farmed corn and soy. And I was like, that's your answer. Your soil is obliterated. Sure. You have to get really, really focused on rebuilding that organic matter and that soil biology before you can get healthy flowers to really be able to thrive in that environment. And so, so I think my seed mix that I'm trailing right now, and I worked with the pasture and range guy at my Oregon State University Extension to come up with. And so I think we have 17 different kinds of plants in there, and it's a very even mix of grasses, legumes, brassicas, and broadleaves. And it was fun for me to come up with it with him because he's such a range guy and he's so focused on just grasses and maybe a little bit like alfalfa or something here and there to put in for cattle, to put in some nutrient density for cattle. But mine it's very, very, very flower heavy. Sure. And we have bird's foot trefoil in there, and we have sandfoin and red clover, and we also have mustard and a few different kinds of mustard and buckwheat and phacelia and 4 different kinds of sunflowers. And okra is my wild card. I'm excited to see if we can get okra to grow because it's supposed to be an extremely good pollinator plant as well as very nutritionally dense for grazers. So so I think it can be a yes and with feeding both our honeybees and our native bees on agricultural landscapes. And I think it can be a yes and with you can put some native wildflowers out there as well as things like mammoth sunflowers and okra and phacelia and buckwheat and different kinds of clovers. It doesn't have to be one thing or the other. I think it just, and then also of course, the trees and the shrubs, we just need more diversity on the landscape.
Sure.
And like you said, it's not easy. It's not easy to figure this out. If it was easy to figure out, we would all be doing it already.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's funny because I am from Kansas, so it makes sense that I was doing a study on soils and corn. But it's different as far as the zoning goes, throughout the country. I mean, the plants that are going to be grown in Oregon are going to be way different than the plants that we can grow here in Florida. I was very surprised at how much sand we actually have here.
And to add to that, ecotypes are different. Partridge pea is something that's grown in a lot of places around the U.S., but if you don't have a local ecotype, just because you're planting it and just because it's native doesn't mean it's going to thrive in Florida, as an example. We've seen that. So as we're talking about regionalized mixes created from seeds that are probably ecotype locally, relevant. There's a lot that has to go into this. It's a lot of research.
Yeah, feel free to send your seeds over this way, and we'll try to grow them and not make them invasive around here.
Well, Sarah, last question for you. How can people find out more about you and your program?
Everything's on my website. So, beegirl.org. And then I'm also really active on social media, Instagram and Facebook. I'm up to a lot of stuff all the time, and I'm pretty good about updating people about what I'm up to. And I use the hashtag regenerative bee pasture.
Sure.
So people, if they want to find specific posts that are just about that, they can find that.
And they can find you on your social media accounts at Sarah B Girl, and that's Sarah with an H, right?
Yep, exactly.
And again,
so my seed mix is on the blog. There's a regenerative bee pasture blog on my website, and my seed mix is up there if anybody wants to check it out, because that's the one thing that people always ask me after I do a talk on my bee pasture project is, oh, what's your seed mix?
Yeah, sure.
But again, it's just like you said,
exactly.
Yep. It totally depends upon where you are in the country and how much sun you have and how much moisture you have and what kind of soil types that you have. So this is what I'm working with for the West Coast and for more arid areas. And but even I just put a proposal in to work on a project, a rangeland project here in Southern Oregon, and there's 9 different types of soil on 200 acres. So
well, Sarah, you'll be happy to know that we even have our own seed mixtures on our website and the research we've done. And incidentally, listeners, all that information about Sarah, her interview, the links that she's talked about, as well as anything we have about this topic, we'll put on our show notes that you can find. So, Sarah, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate having you for this podcast.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to sit down with you two this morning. And it was a great conversation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about my work.
So everyone, that was Sarah Red-Laird, who is the founder and executive director of the Bee Girl organization, which is a nonprofit with a mission to educate and inspire communities to conserve bees, their flowers, and our countryside. Sarah, thank you for joining us on Two Bees in a Podcast.
Thank you.
For additional resources, visit the podcast page on our website, ufhoneybee.com.
We're continuing today our discussion of apiary pests. These are things that bother honeybee colonies from the outside in. Today, to join us to talk about that, of course, is Amy Vu.
Hi.
And Dr. Bill Kern, who's the Associate Professor in Entomology from the Entomology and Nematology Department at the University of Florida's Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center. Welcome back, Bill.
Thank you.
Bill, we're talking about something today that kills actually quite a few colonies in Florida, not just Florida, but really around the U.S., and that is the bear, right? So why are bears a problem for bees?
Well, black bears are intelligent. They're strong.
Wow.
And
describing me.
They're
covered in hair.
Bill,
you got me.
Bill just rolled his eyes.
In case you can't see
they're
that.
a tad bigger than you.
Oh, that felt like a burn.
Okay, so they're omnivores, just like we are, and they love all the yummy goodness inside a beehive.
So you mentioned black bears specifically. Like, there's lots of different types of bears. Why are you picking on black bears? Or is it because they're the bigger of the bear problems versus the brown bears, the grizzly bears? Or?
They tend to be a more of a problem. They tend to have a wider distribution in North America.
Okay.
And in other parts of the world, you're going to have different bear species.
Yeah.
The only continent that doesn't have bears is Africa.
Okay.
So Asia has bears.
Bill, what bear's in Antarctica?
The polar bear.
No.
That's north.
Oh, man.
Oh, gosh. I'm grateful this is a bee podcast, Amy.
I'm not a polar bear expert.
Well,
Bill's going to walk that back. People always forget poor little Antarctica hanging out down there by itself.
Well, Antarctica has the leopard seal, which is
a swimming bear. Are you going to tell me that's a swimming bear?
That's a swimming bear.
Oh, Bill, I can barely take it. All right.
Oh.
All right, let's be serious. People want to learn from this podcast, I think. All right, so bears can be a problem. People always associate bear issues like Winnie the Pooh, right? Winnie the Pooh goes boppling up to a tree, reaches his hand into a hornet's nest, and pulls out honey, right? That's usually the way that beehives are drawn on Winnie the Pooh. But are bears going after just honey? Why would they attack a honeybee colony?
Well, they're going after everything in the honeybee colony.
Yeah, sure.
They'll chew up the comb.
Yep.
To get the honey.
Mm-hmm.
They'll go in to eat the brood, and they're probably actually getting a fair amount of nutrition from the pollen stores as well.
Sure.
So there's all kinds of yummy things in that hive that bears are going to go after. So, and it's not just, okay, I'm going to stick my paw in the entrance and pull back some honey. No, they'll knock over the hive, and they will just spread your frames everywhere. They'll eat whatever they can, and they don't seem to be overly concerned about the bees' defensive behavior.
You know, they're pretty incredible animals. When I first moved to Florida, I heard about the exotic animals, the alligators, the Florida panther, things like that. But I hadn't really thought about Florida as a bear state. And, we have this black bear that's really throughout the Southeast and other parts of the U.S. These bears, we've had apiaries lost. We've certainly had colonies taken over by bears. And we've had instances where bears would pick up the hive and take it with them into the woods and then dismantle it there and eat the contents. And in fact, in these areas, we'll talk about this more in a moment, but in these areas where bears are present, we've had to put up bear fences. Let's not talk about control just yet, but let's talk about specifically the damage that they can do.
It's a pretty, I feel like a lot of the beekeepers that I've encountered, especially here in Central Florida, they have encountered bear issues at some point or another, or they know someone who's experienced the bear issues, and they usually take pictures and start sharing them.
Yeah, I'm from Georgia, and even though there are bears in central and southern Georgia, the bigger the biggest problem for bears is in North Georgia and the mountains, and all the beekeepers in the North Georgia mountains and really through the Appalachians will put bear fences around their bears. Again, we'll talk about the control in a moment, but these things are a big problem. And because we don't visit apiaries every day, we don't discover that there's a bear problem until the bear's been doing its thing for a week or 2 weeks. And at that point, you can have had a number of colonies taken over.
Yeah, and especially when you have your apiary, up in the mountains.
Yeah.
You put your bees out to get a crop of
sourwood honey.
Sourwood honey or
tulip poplar. All
honey.
Kinds of things up there. That's why I'm here, Bill. To spoon feed you.
Yes. Now, or in Indiana, it would be basswood honey.
Yep.
But when you have those colonies and those apiaries out in the woods, where you put them out there, and you may check them once every 2 weeks or once a month. But once the bears find a colony or an apiary, they will keep going back until there's nothing left. So one of the things that we try to do is we don't want the bears to learn that our beehives are good sources of food.
An ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. You're wanting to prevent the problem in the case of bears. You want to address it before you have it, because once bears have figured out where your bees are, Bill, you're right, they're going to keep coming back.
So then what do we do to control it?
The simplest thing is to make sure you don't have any branches hanging over your bee yard, and then use electric fences. We generally recommend that you use a fencer, which is the thing that charges the wire, that is good for up to a 5-mile fence.
That's right.
Backyard fencers just don't do the job. They're only good for about a half an acre area. So you want a charger that will charge up to 5 to 10 miles worth of linear fence line. And some people like to use the braided ribbons because they tend to be a little bit stronger. The wires are woven into nylon, and it tends to make it harder for the bears to break the wire. Sometimes what they'll do is if they've learned that the hives are a good place for food, they'll just go in and they'll just hit that wire. They'll take the shock and snap the wire and then just walk right in. And we've seen bears that have figured out, okay, I can jump over the fence and it hurts, but
it's worth it.
It's worth it.
Or I can crawl under the fence. And you mentioned this whole thing about branches touching beehives. What does that mean?
Yeah. The other thing that bears will do is they'll climb up a tree and they will go out on the branch and drop inside of your electric fence.
And then you say, "How do you get out, stupid?"
Oh, then they just burst out.
So what Bill's describing here for you listeners, he's describing a bear fence, right? And so bear fences, there are lots of resources for building bear fences. In fact, we even have some resources that we'll put up for this particular podcast episode. But the fences are best if they have 3 wires. You mentioned a 5 to 10 mile charger. If that doesn't make sense to you now, when you go to the hardware store and look at these different chargers, you can see it'll tell you 5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles. And so obviously the higher the number of miles, the greater the number of miles, the more you're going to have to pay for that. I would recommend using a solar charger. A lot of people just use straight up like a car battery or something to keep that thing going. But a solar charger means that it's going to, keep it going, and you won't have to change out batteries.
And that will recharge your battery.
Exactly.
So it'll be continuous.
Exactly.
So if you don't have access to electricity, that's a good choice.
Yeah.
Even with a deep cycle, like a marine battery, it's going to run out, after a couple of days.
Yeah. I've known commercial beekeepers who essentially have a rotation of batteries back at their shop. Every time they go out to work in apiary, they'll take a freshly charged battery, exchange it out for the one that's been sitting in the field, and bring that one back and put it on a battery charger waiting to go back next time with them. But I like the solar chargers. You just have to pay a little bit extra for the solar panel.
And the other thing that's important is when you set up your fence, make sure your charger, your battery, and your solar panels are inside the fence.
That's right.
Because bears seem to know if they knock over your charger and cause a wire to become disconnected, it doesn't work anymore. And they can actually hear it humming. And they can tell when that charger is active and when it's not.
So Bill, I was given the coolest tip when I was much younger and working with a commercial beekeeper up in the North Georgia mountains. He had bear fences. This beekeeper, I'm going to give him a shout out. That's Carl Webb. He taught me a lot about beekeeping in the mountains. He always told me you could tell the fence was working if you take a long piece of grass and put the tip of the grass on the fence and then slowly move your hand forward with the grass touching the fence until you start to feel just a little bit of a tingle. Right? And that you kind of walk your way to that fence essentially with your hand in that piece of grass. And then when you feel it, you'll know that it's properly charged. If you get too close too fast, it'll zap you. But that's always been a neat way to test that the fence is still working. You're going to obviously have to keep things from touching the fence, no limbs, no grass, etc., so that it doesn't ground out. But again, there's proper instructions for that here at our website that you'll be able to find for the show notes. So apart from bear fences, what else can you do to keep bears out of your apiary?
There's not a lot of other things you can do.
Exactamundo.
Now, for some things, some nuisance wildlife, there are things you can use like effigies. There was a device we used to use for keeping birds away from catfish farms. It was called Scary Man.
Yeah.
And it had a motion sensor, and it had a fan, and it had a speaker. And if you got too close to it, the fan would go on, the body would expand.
Well, that is freaking me out, Bill.
And it's like those.
When you go by the used car salesman.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, we know those guys. I'd be a little nervous if I was walking around the field and one of those popped up and started shaking at me.
Yeah. Well, you can imagine how a bear would feel.
Yeah.
So they have
Actually,
tried,
I can't.
Jamie's like, I understand.
Yeah.
The problem with anything that's repellent is that in time any animal can get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
And if the bees know that there's honey in those hives, putting up electric fence after the fact is not going to do any good.
That's right. The key is doing it in advance before you ever have a problem. If you have a problem and then try to solve it with a fence, it's often late. If you have a problem, you probably need to move your apiary. Mm-hmm. Yep, at that point.
And then, of course, there's also the other trick is, while you're out in the bee yard, you just take a long piece of bacon, hang it from your hot wire on top to your ground wire on the bottom or in the middle, and you just wait for it to cook.
By the time you're done working your bees,
and then you make yourself a bacon sandwich.
That's clever.
BLT. Is it true that the reason why beekeepers wear light clothes is so that we don't look like we're a bear? Is that true? Did I just make that up?
So there's two reasons I've heard, right? Number one, I think the most practical reason is that bees, well, first of all, there's two things, right? One practical reason is that bees do, in fact, attack dark colors. Mm-hmm. And so people have always said that they're major predators, bears, honey badgers, wherever on the planet you are, often are dark. So they'll sting dark colors. I think another more likely reason is just hot. It's hot to wear dark colors, right? So we wear light colors because it's better that way.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So thinking about these bears, we're almost done here with this segment, Bill. I wanted to ask you a question. When I first got hired at UF, this was one of the first documents I had to review as a new faculty member, and at the time, the older document said the Fish and Wildlife, the group that would deal with nuisance bears, would actually trap a bear and then pull their tooth so that bear would associate that location with a little bit of pain so that they wouldn't come back to that location. Is that real, or is that something? I know I've read it.
I've never heard that. And more likely what they were doing is they were pulling a tooth so they could take a cross-section, and then they could determine how old the bear was.
Okay.
So, and they can get some idea
reasonable.
of its health condition and its age.
All right, so in summary, guys, bears are a problem for bee colonies in areas where bears are present. They're going to those colonies to eat more than just honey, the brood, the pollen, perhaps some wax. We know they're going after honey as well. They'll cause significant damage, destroying the physical hive. They can carry hives off. They tend to do this at nighttime, and they can do it over multiple nights until you discover it's happened. The best way to stop this problem is to prevent it and actually keep your apiaries in a bear fence prior to having a bear problem, because once the bears discover your colonies are there, it is too late. Am I right, Bill? Did I get all of that?
That's correct.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining us. That's Dr. Bill Kern, Associate Professor of Entomology in the Entomology and Nematology Department from the University of Florida, Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center. Thank you for joining us as we talk about bears as apiary pests.
Thank you.
It's everybody's favorite game show, Stump the Chump.
It's that question and answer time. Jamie, I have a couple of questions from people on Facebook.
All right, looking forward to trying.
Awesome. So the first question is from Bobby.
Hey, Bobby.
Bobby on Facebook. So he said that as he begins to add supers to his hives, that he knows that there's a recommended sequence, right? So when he adds a second super, he's going to put it on top of his deep box.
Yep, I kind of know where that question's heading. All right, so it's basically Bobby's asking is, should I bottom super or should I top super? And if I bottom super, what's the order to do that? So for those of you who don't know, let's put our imagination caps on for just a second. You've got a deep brood box, right? A full-size, deep Langstroth-style brood box. Then let's put a medium box on top of that that's full of honey, and that medium box is the honey for that colony. So that's the standard hive.
Yep.
One deep and one medium. I'm just giving this as fictitious. So let's say your honey flow starts. Where do you put that first super where you're going to collect honey? Well, if it's your first honey super, you'd put it on top of
so
the
you
two
just
boxes
stack
already
it
there.
on top.
Yes. So now let's say the honey flow is really going well. Does that next super that you want to add go under the super you just added or over the super you just added? It's the bottom versus top super debate. And the research has shown, do you want to know?
I want to know.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't?
It doesn't
Really?
matter significantly. A lot of people have convinced themselves that if they put the empty supers closer to the brood box, in other words, under all the full supers, that they might get more honey quicker. But it's just simply not supported.
I mean,
so
for me...
I always tell people, save your back and put the empty super on top.
That's exactly what I was going to say. For me, it'd be easier to just put another super on top.
But you know what's funny, Amy, is despite that, I still find myself bottom supering because it just, like, in my mind makes sense, so I want to do it.
Yeah.
So Bobby's question is where would I put that second or third super? Well, if you're bottom supering, you would put it under all of the other honey supers that have been added, which would raise the entire pile. So you know, it'd go under the first super, and the third super would go under the second super, which is under the first super. So basically you're adding and pushing those up. But ultimately, I don't think it's necessary. You just put them on top, save yourself the trouble.
How many supers have you had stacked up?
So when I was a kid, I used to super in deeps. So that was back when my back was invincible.
Yeah.
And the average deep is about 2 shallows or medium and a half. And so I've had 3 deeps on a hive before. So what would that be? About 6 shallows, somewhere 4.5 mediums. When I grew up in Georgia, when I was up there.
Impressive. All right.
I was impressive. Oh, you're talking about my bees.
Past tense.
Okay.
Okay, so the next question is from Heather on Facebook, and she's wondering if there's any information on azaleas and honeybees.
So it's a good question, mainly because I don't know the answer. So I'm going to tell you what I do know and what I've looked up and found since.
I mean, I see bees on my azaleas.
Yeah, honeybees or bumblebees?
I see bumblebees and carpenter bees.
So that's the key. So I have honeybees and I also have azaleas, and I've never seen my honeybees working azaleas. That does not mean that they don't work azaleas. I've quickly looked on the internet and people have posted pictures of honeybees on azaleas. I think the reason the question was asked is because azaleas are related to rhododendrons, and rhododendrons can produce toxic nectar. So if honeybees are foraging on that, the nectar that comes from, the honey that comes from that nectar can actually be toxic for humans and other mammals. But I just don't think that in much of the U.S. that honeybees visit azaleas in nearly the densities that would lead to a problem downstream. And that's if azalea nectar is toxic the way that rhododendron nectar. And there's a lot of ifs in that statement. So it's not something I...
Say if one more time.
Yeah, it's not something I sweat over. And I tell you, I live in the South and there's there's azaleas everywhere.
Sure.
And I just have never heard a story about... people getting sick from eating azalea honey. Heck, I've never even seen a jar of azalea honey. On the other hand, I looked it up online, and there are beekeepers from around the world who are, quote, producing azalea honey. So maybe it's a different story elsewhere, but I don't think it's a big problem here.
Be interested to go and test it in the lab.
Indeedly do.
All right. The last question we have is from Melissa, again, on Facebook. We've had a lot of Facebook messages lately.
Well, we've got a lot of followers on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so keep it up. Tell your friends.
We do. We'll have to do like Snapchat and whatnot, add more.
Is Whatnot, you just saying Whatnot, or is that also an app?
WhatsApp. Whatnot. Oh, gosh.
No, seriously. I'm so old. I don't really know. There's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. There's Snapchat. Is there Whatnot? Or did you
I just said that and Whatnot.
My bad.
It's not.
Is there my bad? Because if there's not, we need to make it.
We can start that. Okay. So Melissa was wondering, she has an oak tree that was killed during hurricane.
Okay.
The tree fell on top of her house and there are still a lot of bees in it.
In that tree?
In the tree. Mm-hmm. So about 25 feet of the trunk is still there.
Okay.
And she can hear the bees. So she's wondering how she can get rid of them.
So there's one of two things that you can do. Number one, you can contact a beekeeper who will come and try to remove that colony and perhaps put it in a hive and take it back to their operation and try to manage it. In some cases, depending on the way the colony is in that tree or how difficult it is to get in there, it may be very difficult to remove that colony alive, but a beekeeper can certainly try. Mm-hmm. The second option is you can contact a pest control operator who will come and treat that colony. And you've got to know that if you elect that option, which is it's an acceptable option, if you decide to do that, the pest control operator is going to eradicate that colony. So you've got beekeepers who will try to remove it alive, and you've got pest control operators who will eradicate it. But if it's posing a problem to you, I would strongly recommend that you have something done about it. You need to contact one of those two individuals.
And I mean, on that note, people who are arborists won't actually work on your trees until you get that handled and taken care of.
And another important note too is they might say, well, that's all well and good, Jamie, but how do I find a beekeeper and how do I find a pest control operator? Well, pest control operators are generally pretty easy to find because they're businesses that you can just Google, pest control in my area. But likewise, there are local beekeeper clubs all around the U.S., heck, for that matter, all around the world. So you probably have a local beekeeper club near you. You can just Google where you live. In my case, it'd be Gainesville beekeepers. Google, Tampa beekeepers, Washington beekeepers, New York City beekeepers, and you're likely to find beekeepers in your area.
Are you going to be able to find beekeepers by Googling?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find beekeepers by Googling. You're finding local bee clubs.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I'm just giving you a hard time.
Yeah, once you get to the local bee club, you'll be able to figure out who there can provide that service for you.
Great. All right. Keep the questions coming. We love them. Email us, call us. Don't call us, actually, because I might not pick up the phone.
It's like you answer the phone, Amy.
I'll be sitting here podcasting. But all the social media, we really enjoy all the questions that are being asked.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on Two Bees in a Podcast.
We'd like to give an extra special thank you to the following. To our editors, Shelby Howell and Bailey Carroll, and to our audio engineer, James Weaver. Without their hard work, Two Bees in a Podcast would not be possible. So thank you.
For more information and additional resources for today's episode, don't forget to visit the UF-IFAS Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory's website, ufhoneybee.com. Do you have questions you want answered on air? If so, email them to honeybee@ifas.ufl.edu or message us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at UF Honeybee Lab. While there, don't forget to follow us. Thank you for listening to Two Bees in a Podcast.